Tonight, is the conflict in the Middle East set for a major escalation? Rishi Sunak is holding a call with his cabinet in the next hour ahead of potential US-UK strikes against the Houthis in Yemen. It comes as Iran admits it was responsible for seizing an oil tanker in the Gulf of Oman in the latest threat to shipping in the region. Also tonight, as the official investigation into the post office scandal hears from a man whose work led to criminal proceedings, we look at whether some leading politicians are being scapegoated. A leading centrist Conservative MP tells me he won't support the government's Rwanda bill if it's toughened up. Can Rishi Sunak prevent a major split in his party as 50 MPs sign up for a rebel amendment? And after a Conservative MP throws down an election challenge to Gary Lineker, we look at other times celebrities have entered the political fray. All that and more with Salma Shah and Andrew Fisher, who will be with us for the next hour. It's Thursday, I'm Sophy Ridge, live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. In 45 minutes' time, there will be a full cabinet call. Rishi Sunak deciding that something so serious is about to happen that every member of the cabinet needs to be informed. Now, right now, I don't know for sure what it's going to be about, but we can have a good guess, because British and US forces appear to be gearing up to strike a militant group in Yemen, the Houthi rebels, who are backed, crucially, by Iran. The reason? Continued Houthi attacks on ships in the Red Sea. Now, on Tuesday night, one former senior diplomat told me it was only a matter of time. The UK would have to retaliate. And it feels like tonight he will be proved right. But just think about this for a minute. This is not about a few ships. The Houthis are backed by Iran. I don't need to tell you that the Middle East is in a pretty precarious position right now. Regional powers like Iran have been watching the Israel-Hamas war and waiting. And there's been another major development today as well, because Iran has confirmed that its forces have seized an oil tanker in the Gulf of Oman. The tanker, named the St. Nicholas, was reported to have been boarded by armed men in military uniforms this morning. Well, the United Kingdom Marine Trade Operations described receiving a report from the ship's security manager and hearing unknown voices over the phone alongside the ship's captain. Well, this marine traffic time-lapse shows the route taken by the oil tanker before it was seized by the Iranian Navy. It was reported to have been boarded on Thursday morning, some 50 miles off the coast of Oman. And the same oil tanker was actually once involved in a dispute with the US Justice Department that saw 1 million barrels of Iranian crude oil seized. So the new move by the Iranians was reportedly in retaliation.
I think it's definitely been done by the Iranians to provoke some reaction from particularly the US and the other allies in the region. It may cause them to split their resources, use their carrier aircraft in another area, for example. So, yeah, there's definitely an intention behind the Iranians with regards to this boarding today of that tanker to switch attention away from the Red Sea and towards the Persian Gulf.
Well, the incident comes amid high tensions in the nearby Red Sea, where attacks by the Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen have been disrupting shipping since November. The UK Defence Secretary Grant Shapps warned that Yemen's Houthi fighters yesterday that enough is enough, and when asked about retaliatory action, said, "Watch this space." Well, in a moment, we're hoping to go to our Deputy Political Editor at Downing Street. But in the meantime, let's introduce our first guest, shall we? Sir William Patey, thank you so much for being with us. Someone who's got a wealth of experience in this area. What do you think is about to happen?
Well, I suspect we can't do nothing now. The Houthis were given a warning to stop attacking shipping. They've continued to do so. The option of just continuing to intercept sort of tens of drones worth tens of thousands with missiles cost $1 million isn't in the long term very feasible. So I'm sure that both the Americans, Brits and the other members of the international coalition will be considering whether there are feasible targets that can be struck in Houthi-run territory of Yemen that are viable. That is the problem. And we saw in the civil war in Yemen when the Saudis were fighting the Houthis, you run out of credible targets, frankly, military targets.
What does that mean? Targets that are viable?
Well, you'd be looking for a base where missiles are being fired from. So I suppose you need somewhere where you know the drones are being stored, or perhaps where the drones are being imported, where they are launched from. Those are the targets you would wanting to hit, because you will not want to get into the game of civilian casualties and hitting civilians. And the Houthis will be probably, as they have done in the past, been firing these missiles from built-up areas, so that it makes it more difficult to target them. It's not a nice military base in the middle of nowhere you can have a go at.
And what could the consequences be for this action? I mean, you hear the word Iran, and it sounds worrying.
Well, some months ago when we talked about the war in Gaza spreading, well, it has spread. So, I mean, we're seeing exchanges in Lebanon with Hezbollah. We've seen the assassination of the Hamas leader Aruri in Lebanon, and the killing of a Hezbollah leader. So we're already seeing that area of escalation, which is one of the areas. The Red Sea was another area highlighted as possible escalation, and that's already happened. And the third area of potential escalation was shipping in the Straits of Hormuz in the Gulf. And it may be unrelated, but this Iranian seizing of an oil tanker is part of a long-running saga between the Americans and the Iranians over oil and sanctions. But that all adds to the tension. I mean, ultimately, the biggest danger is that we end up in a conflict with Iran, because the Houthis are acting here not on their own, but as agents of Iran.
What, and you think that could be a possibility then?
I think both sides would want to avoid it. The Iranians certainly don't want to get into a conflict, and neither does the United States, or certainly not the UK. But there is a danger of miscalculation. You know, a missile hits a US warship, soldiers are killed. That raises the stakes. At the moment, you know, nobody in the Red Sea is being killed. The drones are being intercepted. That keeps it at a reasonable level of tension. But the danger of miscalculation and escalation is right there. It's a hair trigger.
Does this have anything to do with the war between Israel and Hamas?
Well, not really, except that, you know, Iran is seeking to exploit the understandable anger in the Arab world. And there is seething anger in the Arab world at the extent of the civilian loss of life and what's happening in Gaza. They're seeking to exploit that. They've long been supporters of Hamas. They've long been keen that any moves towards peace, however tenuous they were, don't come to fruition. So Iran is seeking to exploit that. And so there's a link in the sense that they're exploiting the anger, but I mean, it has no impact on Israel's ability or willingness to continue its campaign in Gaza.
I do want to go to Sam Coates in Downing Street. I hope you don't mind. I might ask you to stay for a little bit to get a bit more of your kind of expertise just after we cross to Downing Street to get the update from their Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates at Downing Street. Sam, what are we expecting from the Prime Minister later this hour?
Of his full cabinet. As you were saying, Sophie, they haven't formally briefed why this call is happening, but it only happens, a cabinet meeting only happens at short notice when there's a moment of national importance. And we know the issue on Rishi Sunak's desk. At the weekend, we were telling you that told you at the weekend that Rishi Sunak is being presented by the Ministry of Defence, by the Foreign Office, with a recommendation that Britain should be able and should be willing to fire back on these Houthi rebels, the Shia group that are attacking vessels that are going through the key Red Sea Straits near Yemen. Just a bit of context, Sophie. Every time there's an attack and it deters one of those ships, they have to go back round the Cape of Good Hope, round South Africa. That adds £1 million in cost, 20 days to the journey, ultimately pushes up prices for everybody in this country. So the British government, together with the Americans, look very likely to take action. They'll take action soon after any public announcement. You can't keep this kind of thing secret and then let it slip out and then not take action fairly soon after that. We understand that the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence have recommended that the Prime Minister take action if those attacks continued. There have continued to be attacks this week, and that's why we're expecting that cabinet call, no doubt, to rubber stamp Rishi Sunak's decision, and probably there to be some action pretty soon after that.
Sam, thank you very much indeed. I'm sure we'll have more from Downing Street in the hour as we count down to that cabinet call. Well, this is a story of two halves, really, the UK response, but also the US response. So let's bring in our US correspondent now, shall we? James Matthews is with us from Washington. What are we expecting in the US?
Nothing's been said publicly of any great substance, Sophie. We're expecting a briefing from the Pentagon fairly shortly. Admiral John Kirby has been on his feet at the White House for a regular briefing. He was asked about the US, the Houthis, and the possibility of military action. His response was this. He said, "I'm not going to telegraph anything here in this public forum. We're going to do what we have to do," he said, "to counter and defeat these threats that just keep being thrown up towards commercial shipping in the Red Sea. We'll continue to consult with allies," he said, "and partners about the appropriate next steps." Admiral John Kirby was asked about the Houthi threat, that if there was any kind of attack, then there would be retaliation more forceful than we saw on Tuesday, the largest attack yet by the Houthis in the Red Sea. John Kirby didn't respond to that. So that's what we have on the record publicly from the Americans at this stage. But clearly the events in the Red Sea have been exercising Joe Biden's mind. He is a president, of course, criticised on a number of levels for his stewardship in this Middle East conflict. In terms of striking back at the Houthis, he's come under pressure to re-establish proper and appropriate deterrence, pressure from inside the Pentagon, amongst other places. I mean, the Americans have been attacked over many months by Iranian-backed militia groups in Iraq, in Syria. No American personnel have been killed in these attacks, but these have certainly been injured. And of course, the Houthis continue to attack. Tuesday was the biggest. There has been US Houthi engagement. That came at the turn of the year. American helicopters fired on Houthi gunboats and 10 Houthi rebels were killed. The US military has been lining up potential targets. Now, these include radar sites, launch sites for missiles, and also munitions depots. So the intelligence has been carried out in terms of the road ahead and whether or not there will be a military attack. Then that will be a matter for Biden ultimately. Antony Blinken, of course, the Secretary of State, he's on his way back from a tour of the Middle East. He went into that trip, his fourth, since the conflict started between Israel and Hamas, saying that a widening or an escalation of the conflict wouldn't be in anybody's interest. And that, of course, is the big danger when the United States, UK and allies go down the road of attacking Iranian-backed militias. The question is, how far does that road lead to Iran itself, the confrontation that nobody is keen on?
Thank you very much indeed. James Matthews there from the Washington, from the US. Well, let's go back to Sir William Patey, shall we, who served as the UK ambassador to Iraq and Saudi Arabia, also the former head of the Middle East Department at the Foreign Office. Now, I'm going to let you into something at home. Unfortunately, Sir William couldn't hear, because of a few technical issues in the studio, couldn't hear what James Matthews and Sam were both saying. But effectively, it looks like both the US and the UK gearing up to some kind of response. Is this something that they're effectively being pulled into, kicking and screaming? It's something they don't want to do?
Well, it's certainly not something they wanted to do. I mean, you don't hold an emergency cabinet meeting unless you're considering a military response. So that seems to be the conclusion I would draw from the fact that the Americans are meeting and we've got an emergency cabinet meeting. The Americans have clearly put some military options on the table and have invited us to participate. So it'll be something they'll be reluctant to do, but Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, hinted at it basically, said, if the Houthis don't stop, then there will be consequences. So, and I think the consequences will be that they will have identified targets in Yemen to be attacked, and we may well see that this evening. Over the course of this evening, we could see British planes and probably missiles, I would think, being fired from the very capable ships that are currently in the Red Sea.
And how do these kind of cabinet calls usually play out? Do you think that there'll be a lot of agreement in the room? Is this like a rubber stamping exercise?
It'll be rubber stamping, but the Prime Minister will want backing. He won't want to take this decision on his own because, there is the possibility of you escalate and you don't go into a military conflict lightly. So he will certainly want cabinet agreement to the measures that are being proposed. Anything much more significant, and then you would need to get Parliament involved. And I would expect if there is action overnight tonight, that there'll be a statement in Parliament tomorrow, although Friday's not a great time for statements in Parliament, but I imagine there will be. So if that's all happening, and they won't spend a lot of time pondering it, giving the Houthis time to cover up their missiles and move them out of harm's way.
Yeah, as you said, those are all important, viable targets. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme this evening. Fast-moving story, could see strikes tonight, could see a statement in Parliament tomorrow. Coming up on the Politics Hub. The public inquiry into the Post Office scandal resumed today as Labour warned the Conservatives to stop slinging mud at opposition politicians. We'll discuss that next.
I'm Martin Brunt, and I'm Sky's crime correspondent. My most memorable story was, and still is, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann.
Please, please do not hurt her. Please give our little girl back.
We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news.
For detectives, the first 48 hours after a murder are crucial in the search for clues. The public expects them to find Jill Dando's killer soon. The British detectives are planning to meet forensic experts, academics, and even witch doctors.
I remember the grimmest case, the Soham murders of schoolgirls Holly and Jessica. I felt I can't undo what's happened, but I can help explain it.
Ian Huntley was arrested and charged within a fortnight of the murders.
I've never murdered anyone. I've never raped anyone. What am I in jail for?
The parole board has to decide if Bronson needs to be kept locked up for the safety of the public. My biggest challenge was to persuade a jailed diamond thief to answer my letters. Martin Brunt, Sky News, at the Old Bailey.
Hello, welcome to the Politics Hub. This evening, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, has called a cabinet call at 7:45 p.m. We don't know what it's about currently, But all of the speculation is that this is to talk about airstrikes, US-UK strikes on Houthi targets, Houthi rebel targets in Yemen. Critically, they are backed by Iran. Well, our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, is in Downing Street for us this evening to tell us more. Sam.
Yes, so 25 minutes until that unusual gathering at short notice of the whole cabinet on the phone for a briefing from the Prime Minister, which we believe is likely to be linked to the incidents that have been going on in the Red Sea with those Shia-backed rebels, the Houthi rebels attacking commercial ships in that critical trade passage. Now, over the last few weeks, Britain and America have been sending military ships to the region to try and deter the Houthi rebels from their assaults on those ships. Now, repeated warnings, including the one to Deborah Haynes from Grant Shapps yesterday, have been issued by Britain and America, warning that there will be proper military retaliation if those attacks continued. We have, in the last few moments, got what we think may well be the final trigger for potential action. There's a statement from the Americans that say that at 2 a.m. Yemen time in the Middle East, there was yet another attack by the Houthis. It's the 27th attack, and it was an attack by the Houthis, who fired ballistic missiles from the Houthi-controlled area in Yemen on international shipping lanes. It could well be that that is the thing that has pushed the international community, Britain and America, to act potentially together, potentially in the next few hours. We think that's what the cabinet is going to be gathering in order to talk about on the phone in about 20 minutes. If that happens, if the cabinet gives its assent to the Prime Minister for there to be some kind of military action, I would expect things to move pretty quickly tonight. Normally, when there is some kind of military action, a moment like this, it's often done on a cross-party basis. I wouldn't be surprised if Downing Street start to reach out to other political figures, opposition political figures, other MPs to brief them about what's happening. We may well hear in the coming hours from a member of the government about exactly what the United Kingdom is doing in the Red Sea, what the attack looks like if that is what happens. And it does seem that there are meetings going on in America at the same time, suggesting, all pointing to this being the reason for the short notice cabinet meeting. But a 2 a.m. attack by the Houthis, ballistic missiles from Houthi-controlled areas into international shipping lanes, may well be the final act of aggression, tipping the government over into agreeing with the US that military action is needed now. I know that the Ministry of Defence, the Foreign Office, has basically been inviting Rishi Sunak to be prepared to take such a decision for several days now, because they can see the cost to Britain's credibility if it doesn't act despite issuing all these threats, the cost to prices of stuff as it gets delayed on international shipping routes, potentially the increase in inflation if some of these key cargo routes get blocked by the Houthis. There is a direct link with what's going on elsewhere in the Middle East, which is why members of the cabinet will be so attentive in that cabinet call. The Houthis themselves, as you've been talking about, backed by Iran. Iran also seizing control of another ship in the Gulf. But the Houthis are doing this protest, they say, they're quite upfront about it, because they think that they want to deter ships from going to Israel in protest of the military action that Israel is taking in Gaza because of the Hamas attacks. So there is a direct read across to what's going on in the Middle East, and that is why things are something of a tinderbox at the moment. And the Houthi leaders have been out today warning America in particular, but this warning will apply to Britain as well, that if there is some kind of missile, if there is some kind of attack, so people coming down Downing Street, from the Britain and America against their positions, then they will retaliate. And they have been retaliating to some of the drone strikes, but they say the retaliations to any kind of attack will be of a different order. So that is the kind of issue that the cabinet will have to calibrate and weigh up. Is the risk of basically inflaming what is already a tense and difficult situation by engaging in military action, British and American military action in the Middle East, is that a deterrent worth deploying given all the risks and the knock-ons and the impact that could have? So there will be a lot for the Cabinet, the full Cabinet, to discuss with the Prime Minister in that phone call in 20 minutes or so. Difficult balance as they weigh up striking potentially with British and American missiles, Houthi positions, calculating whether this will drag in Iran yet further, what this will do to the Middle East in a very, very fragile situation. But I think the bottom line, Sophie, is that ministers are likely to have calculated that the Houthis are ignoring the warnings, and if Britain doesn't act, then its bluff has been called. Now is the moment to strike decisively to try and change the facts in that absolutely critical shipping route.
Sam, thank you very much indeed. Sam Coates there in Downing Street, and we'll, of course, give you the readout of that Cabinet call just as soon as we can. Right, let's bring in our duo for this evening, shall we? We're joined by the former Conservative Special Advisor Salma Shah and Andrew Fisher, who was Director of Policy to the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. Great to have you both on the show. Very fast-moving evening for us. You've advised Cabinet Ministers. How unusual is this kind of Cabinet call?
This is exceptionally unusual. So outside of the Tuesday morning Cabinet meeting, Cabinet very rarely discusses things. So just the fact of a 7 p.m. or, nearly 8 p.m. call is something that is quite serious. And as Sir William Patey was saying earlier, the level of the decision that is about to be taken will require some kind of discussion around the Cabinet table to stamp some sort of authority on it. So I think we can judge from that the seriousness of what we're about to see.
How sort of concerned are you about it?
I think what it highlights is the extreme double standards. Here we are, the Houthis have been attacking shipping lanes, no deaths so far, thankfully. Israel's been bombarding Gaza for the last 3 months. Tens of thousands of people died, children being amputated without anaesthetic, and that's fine. No sanctions on Israel, no strikes against them, no arms embargo. But
I guess this is because this is against the UK target, though, right? Is that not?
It's because we don't care about international law or human rights. We have this rhetoric that we do, but we don't. This is absolute nonsense, and this whole conflict is exposing that. We say that, the Iran-backed Houthi rebels, well, they've been bombed by the US and UK-backed Saudi Arabia for the last 10 years. Actually, the last Labour administration was calling for sanctions on Saudi Arabia over this for an arms embargo. Hilary Benz, somebody who's serving under Keir Starmer, was leading this within the last shadow cabinet. So, we talk about this in completely bizarre ways that spins it into this sort of thing of one side is bad and the other side's crimes are airwashed. I mean, we've got a case in the International Court of Justice today brought by South Africa against Israel for genocide. We're not talking about that. We're talking about some interruption to shipping lanes. I mean, it's pretty small-scale stuff when tens of thousands of people are being killed. And, I don't care what adjective you call it, whether you call it a massacre, a slaughter, ethnic cleansing, genocide, it doesn't really much matter. Tens of thousands of people are being killed, and we're not talking about that. We're talking about some shipping lanes. It's perverse, really, and the rest of the world can see it.
Andrew, I recognise and respect your strength of feeling on this, and there'll be a lot of people who are watching this evening who will empathise and sympathise with your view. I think the only thing that I would say to that, and as glib as this may sound to you, is that we do have to deal with realpolitik. And the fact of the matter is that the Security Council passed a resolution on Wednesday that said its members could protect its own vessels, which is what we are attempting to do. And I understand that these things are linked. I do not for one moment separate what is happening in Israel, Gaza, from the impact of this more widely. But what is incumbent upon us is to be able to protect our interests, as Sam rightly pointed out in his report. It is about what is happening to industry.
That's my point. That's our priority, is to protect our interests, not to protect human rights or international law. We don't care about those things unless they coincide with our interests.
I don't think it's that we don't care about those things. I think it's important that they do coincide with our interests, but I also think that it's important that we take this moment where this actually, as we've said, as we can all see, this real tinderbox situation does not get any worse. And I also think that the UK government, alongside its US partner, needs to be very careful in its collaboration about whether it actually incites more violence in the region. Because if they do take a decision tonight that they are going to strike, we're going to have to try and understand in the aftermath what they have hit precisely. Because are we talking about potentially hitting civilian targets as well? How much collateral damage is there going to be? And there will be debate in the aftermath of that. But I don't think it is as clear-cut as to say that we only like our own interests, and we don't care about what's happening with the humanitarian situation in Gaza.
Well, we don't,
I think that's a
still
false
selling arms to
equivalence.
Israel, and so is the US. So they don't care. If we cared, we'd stop it. Look at what we've done with Russia, where we disapprove of their occupation of Ukraine. We've put sanctions on them. We've put sanctions on key officials. We've expelled diplomats. We haven't done any of that with Israel because we think it's fine.
But Russia is a hostile state actor and has been for a very long time.
But that's my point. It's that you say our standards of human rights only apply because they're a bad actor, but because Israel's a good actor, an ally, it's fine for them to get away with human rights abuses. And I'm not criticising you.
No, look, we're having a discussion.
We're putting the British government view, which is what I'm saying is entirely partial. It doesn't believe in universal human rights. It believes in defending human rights where they coincide with our interests. Where they don't, they're completely disposable.
Can I just ask you specifically on the shipping? And I absolutely take your point that these are not things that you can just view in isolation, right? This is a conflict, and we've all got to make decisions about the whole of the region. Everything is linked. But just on the shipping, what do you think the UK government should do?
Well, look, it's a vital trade route for the UK and Europe, and more widely as well. So of course we want to protect that. I don't necessarily say that's wrong. I'm just pointing out the double standard in we care about that, but we don't care about thousands of dead Palestinians. Because if we did, we'd do the things we did against Russia when it was killing Ukrainian and is killing Ukrainian civilians on a albeit smaller scale. But of course we should protect our trade routes, and of course we don't want terrorist actions against shipping because it's civilian shipping. You know, the people on board these ships are not military actors. They need to be protected. I totally support that.
I'm just going to bring you a little bit of breaking news now. We're showing you these live shots of Downing Street. The PM, we're expecting to hold that cabinet call imminently. We can also tell you that the Speaker of the House of Commons, Lindsay Hoyle, is being summoned to a Cabinet Office briefing. He's going to head to the Cabinet Office at 8:10. Sky News understands the Commons Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, will head to the Cabinet Office for a briefing at 8:10 p.m. So that's 40 minutes from now. That feels to me like there is going to be some kind of statement to the House of Commons tomorrow, and that I would imagine this is part of the Prime Minister's attempt to try and get backing from MPs on this.
Yes, and I think what he will want to do with the Speaker is understand what is good parliamentary form and what does he feel is going to be required, because it is a convention that one goes to Parliament and asks for permission to be able to act on military strikes. But it is an executive decision nonetheless. And so being able to do this from a military perspective, at the very least, they are going to require rapid action and not to be dragged into a process where they've got to sort of win a vote or whatever it might be. So it has to be decisive, whatever they do.
How do you think Labour should respond?
I think Labour will respond by backing it purely and simply, and I think it will do that because it doesn't want to have any differences with the Conservatives on foreign policy. It won't say any of the things I've just said. It won't put any kind of moral perspective or human rights perspective because, again, it's pretty much following the US and the Conservatives on this, which is appalling, really. And I think, is what's alienating a lot of people from the Labour Party as well as the Conservative government.
But can I just say, though, it is so easy for us to sit here in this studio and talk about it. We were both players in decision-making, previously. And if we were in that hot seat right now, I don't think either of us would hold our opinions so strongly until we were in receipt of the facts and really understood what the tactical play here was.
Well, look, we're following the US blindly, aren't we? Let's face it, the US has called us up and said, we're going to strike. Do you want to we'd like you to be a part of it, to have a bit of international coalition cover, as always happens. And the UK is... I don't
think the US really needs us if they want to decide to have a strike.
Diplomatic cover.
But I think it's very important that, our forces that are out there at the moment are out there protecting the British interest. And I think what's very important about this as a wider point is to remember that those trade routes are very important to us and, as you said, to Europe and wider, and that we can't recede from our position in the world. And
but these threats to the trade route have only come about because of our complicity in allowing Israel to get away with what it's doing in Palestine.
But the issue with the Houthi rebels against Saudi Arabia it predates this war.
Yes, but it wasn't attacking Red Sea shipping. Not at the same degree.
It's exacerbating things that are existing already. All I am saying is that when we think about the cabinet who is going to sit around that table now and make this decision, that is a hard thing that they are about to do. And I don't think we can simply say, oh, they're just lapdogs of America. I don't think that is fair.
They are doing it because the US has asked them to, and they will say yes. And Labour will back it for that very same reason. You know.
Okay. I think what this perhaps does show is what the strength of feeling on the issue. Clearly, a very difficult issue, but also a cabinet call, talking to the Speaker of the House of Commons. This is a Prime Minister who is trying to get backing in Parliament for actions that feel to me to be pretty imminent. It's a very fast-paced evening, and there is perhaps no surprise that they know what the consequences of this could be. You're looking now at a live shot of the Pentagon in Washington, and that is because coming up shortly, we are expecting an update from the Pentagon Press Secretary, that is Air Force Major General Pat Ryder, which we're going to bring to you live. In the meantime, we can talk to our US correspondent, James Matthews. James, what's happening in Washington?
Hi, Sophie. I have to say I'm struck by the difference, not necessarily in tone, but in content of chatter around any proposed military action, a difference between London and Washington, D.C. The Americans have been relatively quiet in terms of what lies ahead, and contrast that with what we've had from the likes of Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, in the past 24 hours. Phrases like, watch this space, a turn of phrase to turn the head. I mean, he put the brink in brinkmanship and all but signposted military action. We've not had that kind of drumbeat from the Americans. There was a briefing recently in the past hour, Admiral John Kirby at the White House. He was asked about imminent military action against the Houthis, and he wouldn't be drawn on it. His response was, I'm not going to telegraph it here. He spoke about consulting with his allies. His phrase was, we're going to do what we have to do to counter and defeat these threats that just keep being thrown up against commercial shipping. The Americans recently let leak a list of potential targets, and maybe this feeds in to almost the PR of military strikes for the Houthis, for the international audience, who many of whom remain to be satisfied that Joe Biden and the Americans and the allies are presenting an appropriate deterrence in the Red Sea and elsewhere. But on that list, they were talking about potential targets, including radar sites, missile launch sites, and munitions depots. How populated they are in Yemen, that will be a question probably for afterwards. But, you know, clearly there is a risk. You've been discussing it, the risk of escalation. Antony Blinken, who's on his way back from a tour of the Middle East, his fourth tour to the conflict zone since October the 7th, he said it was in nobody's interest to have an escalation. And of course, the difficulty is that when you start confronting Iranian-backed militia, then Iran is in the background. That's Major General Pat Ryder now. Sophie, let's listen in to him at the Pentagon.
According to his doctors, he continues to recover well and is focused on executing his duties as the Secretary of Defense. I don't have an update to provide at this time on when he'll be released from the hospital, but we'll, of course, keep you informed. Separately, the Department of Defense Inspector General has initiated a review to examine the roles, processes, procedures, responsibilities, and actions related to the Secretary of Defense's hospitalization in December 2023 and January 2024, and assess whether the DoD's policies and procedures are sufficient to ensure timely and appropriate notifications and the effective transition of authorities as may be warranted due to health-based or other unavailability of senior leadership. The department welcomes the DoD IG's review and will fully support. While the IG's review is ongoing, it will be inappropriate for us to comment on the specifics of that review, and so I would refer you to the Department of Defense's Inspector General's office for any further questions. Separately, as I highlighted on Tuesday, on January 8th, the Secretary's Chief of Staff directed the DoD's Director of Administration and Management to conduct a 30-day review of the department's notification process for assumption of functions and duties of the Secretary of Defense, in addition to directing several immediate steps to ensure appropriate situational awareness when a transfer of authority occurs. While there's understandably many outstanding questions, it's also important to allow both of these reviews to run their course so that we can ensure a full accounting of the facts, and importantly, to ensure that we can most effectively improve processes and procedures as necessary as well as meet the standards of transparency expected by the American public, Congress, and the news media.
Well, you know what, James Matthews was just talking about the difference in tone between the UK and the US. Radio silence from the US and the UK, where Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, is saying enough is enough, effectively signposting military action. We're going to keep across this scheduled press conference from the Pentagon, and we will dip straight back in if anything is said about the Houthi attacks or potential Houthi attacks that we may be seeing from the UK and the US. In the meantime, we can talk now again to Sir William Patey, served as the UK ambassador to Iraq and Saudi Arabia, former head of the Middle East Department at the Foreign Office. How important for the US, is UK involvement in any action?
Well, I think it's already a multinational operation. Operation Prosperity Guardian has, I think, about 11 nations: Australians, Canadians, Greeks, Dutch, lots of others. So it's already multinational. I mean, what they're doing is protecting international shipping. So that's why I think it's our own direct interests who are involved. You could argue that most of that shipping is bound from Asia to Europe, and it's got not much to do with the United States. But the United States is part of a global alliance. So our direct national interests are engaged. So it will be important, not in military terms. I'm sure the US has enough assets in the area to deliver whatever military response they need. But it's important in terms of alliances.
We've just seen Lord Cameron, and there's Sam Coates waving very excitedly. Lord Cameron, that's why Sam's so excited, has just entered Downing Street, of course, the Foreign Secretary there to meet with the Prime Minister. Let's talk to Sam, shall we? Sam, what's happening?
So you just saw Lord Cameron, David Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, entering number 10. As he went in, I asked him whether or not we'd see missiles this evening. The presence of the Foreign Secretary all but confirms what we felt we knew, which is the cabinet call, which is starting in just 4 minutes. An unusual last-minute summoning of the whole of Rishi Sunak's cabinet by a phone is definitely, given the presence only in person of the Foreign Secretary, about foreign affairs, and therefore almost certainly about what's going on in the Red Sea, where that Shia-backed militia, the Houthis, has been disrupting shipping, and it looks as if Britain may well be on the precipice of retaliating alongside the US against those rebels and trying to stop the disruption to shipping that's been going on for the last few months. This morning at 2 a.m. Middle Eastern time, there was yet another attack from the Houthis, a ballistic missile from areas controlled by them into international shipping lanes. That may well have been the final straw, triggering action likely potentially later this evening. The Prime Minister in just a couple of minutes will gather his cabinet, where he will present what he thinks should be done and seek their backing. It is a difficult calculation that Britain must make, and I understand the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence have been recommending the Prime Minister carefully look at the action now. You have to calculate whether or not this action could spur effectively escalation. Iran is thought to be backing those rebels. Will they be dragged into the
escalation, as Sam Coates there explaining in Downing Street? But I am going to take you to the Pentagon now.
Simply put, Marcus is an outstanding journalist who has never shied away from the tough questions to ensure that the American public and others had the facts when it comes to national security. He's departing Defense One for a career outside of journalism, and so we here at OSD Public Affairs certainly wish him the best and continued success. And with that, I'm happy to take your questions. We'll go to Associated Press, Tara Cobb.
Thank you, General Ryder. You gave us an update on Austin's condition. He's in good condition, but can you tell us the prostate cancer that was discovered, what stage it is, how serious is this? And then secondly, when Deputy Secretary Hicks took over some responsibilities while he was hospitalized, can you give us a sense of what those responsibilities were? Did she have nuclear command and control? Was it something more mundane? And now, what kind of role is she assuming? Because obviously she was doing the honor guard. What else is she taking on right now?
Yeah, sure. In terms of the Secretary's health and the condition, I'm not going to have any more to provide beyond the statement that we issued earlier from his doctors. Certainly, we'll continue to keep you updated going forward. I did speak to his doctors today, And again, they assured me he's in good condition, good spirits, and recovering well. As it relates to the Deputy Secretary, again, for operation security reasons, I'm not going to go into the specifics other than to say certain operational authorities that require secure communications. In other words, at any time, should the Department of Defense be required to make important key strategic defense decisions, there is always someone on the other end of the phone who can make those decisions at the appropriate level. And so this is an important point, that during this situation, at no time was there a gap in command and control for the Department of Defense.
Absolutely
at all times. National security was in good hands, and either the Secretary or the Deputy Defense Secretary were at
Thank you.
Now, what sort of duties is she assuming?
As she's doing the
You
duties.
just pointed out, this is a big deal for us, perhaps not for the US.
Yeah, well, it's a sort of almost a routine policing operation for the US. I think the contrast in the Pentagon have a press conference and they deal with Lloyd Austin's illness, Defence Secretary's illness, important as it is, and we're having an emergency cabinet meeting about the possibility of attacking the Houthis. I suppose it just shows it's a much more consequential decision for us than it is for the Americans. And I think the fact that the Speaker has been called in suggests that. Interestingly, it'll be interesting to see whether they stick to the Constitution in that it is an executive decision that the Prime Minister can order military action. But David Cameron over Syria went to the House of Commons, and you can argue that he created a precedent by seeking parliamentary approval. I would be surprised if they did seek parliamentary approval in advance for the sort of response that we might expect. But it's not impossible.
It's interesting, isn't it? It really is. You're drawing the contrast there between the UK and the US. It feels like here, in the UK, as you said, calling the Speaker, getting the Foreign Secretary, and having a cabinet call. The US, they're not even addressing it necessarily in that press conference there. Whose response do you think is right?
Well, I mean, it's entirely up to the President has the authority to order strikes on the Houthis, retaliatory strikes for their attacks on shipping. That'll be within the President's remit. They're not talking about launching a war. But for Britain, we haven't been involved in military action since Afghanistan, since Iraq. And so it's a big deal for us. And I think it's important that the Cabinet, given the history of military intervention, that the Cabinet is involved and that Parliament takes a view, because it's not insignificant, even although it's something the Americans would contemplate on a regular basis.
It really is quite interesting. How seriously should we take the risk of escalation?
Well, I was just thinking, as waiting, what could the Houthis do in return? There's not many targets for them. There's no British embassy in Sana'a. There's no British assets to speak of in Yemen. They may specifically attack British shipping. At the moment, they say they're attacking Israeli shipping, or Israeli-related shipping, but it seems pretty random and tangential. So they could attack British shipping. The question is whether Iran was to get involved in response to any attacks on Houthi targets, and whether they were to target British shipping in the Gulf. So there is a danger of escalation, but it's not easy for the Houthis to attack directly, and they've no history so far of terrorism outside Yemen. So it's difficult to see what sort of response beyond what they're already doing they would be capable of.
Of course, the backdrop to this is the situation in the Middle East, with the war that's going on between Israel and Hamas, the loss of life that we've seen, appalling images and stories coming out there. How kind of precarious is the situation?
Well, I mean, this is one of the areas we talked about for escalation. The other more serious one, actually, for the Middle East as a whole is Lebanon. The possibility of a war with Lebanon against Hezbollah in Lebanon. And we've seen exchanges of fire and missiles. Lots of Israelis have evacuated the north of the country. The Israelis are telling Lebanese to evacuate the south of their country. So the possibility of a war with Hezbollah, which would bring in Iran, would probably bring in Syria, and could involve the United States in direct conflict with Iran. I mean, that's where the real tinderbox is. I think, in a way, the Iranians have helped the Houthis to do this. It's high profile, but it's a little bit of a sideshow. So the continuation of the Israeli bombardment and the atrocities that are going on in Gaza, the longer that goes on, the higher the chances of it spreading. I think we've already sown the seeds of radicalization for another 20, 30 years. I think
because of the bombardment.
Because of the bombardment, the anger in the Arab world at what's going on in Gaza is sowing seeds that will be fodder to ISIS and Al Qaeda, who haven't gone away. This attack in Iran was ISIS from Afghanistan. These guys are still around, and they can still feed off this anger that is permeating the whole of the Middle East.
And what should the UK government response be when it comes to Israel?
Well, I think we should be saying to the Israelis, enough is enough. I mean, it was a horrific attack on Israel, and they have a right to defend themselves, but within international law and within the limits of responsible behaviour by a state. And the number of civilians who have been killed relative to the population in Gaza, somebody said to me, it's the equivalent of 3.4 million Americans. So imagine 3.4 million Americans being killed. I mean, the 24,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza. As a proportion of the population, that's the equivalence. So the idea that you can just keep going on bombarding civilian areas in the search for Hamas commanders is in my view, just sowing the seeds of conflict for another half century.
Wow, thank you very much indeed. Powerful words there. Well, we're talking about the US response and the contrast between the two countries, the US and the UK. We can go now to James Matthews, who's in Washington. James, what do you make of the briefing so far?
Low-key. It's low-key on this side of the Atlantic, Sophie. Major Pat Ryder, we heard him at the Pentagon giving a briefing. He was asked one question. I mean, the seasoned Pentagon military press corps, it was question number 5 or 6. They asked him about the Houthis, and he was able to give them information that there was an attack today, an anti-ship attack by Houthis from Yemen that was targeting commercial shipping, no injuries, and it seemed to pass without incident. The subject of the day, the headline story, was Lloyd Austin, of course, the US Defense Secretary, who has prostate cancer, who was in hospital over the festive period and appeared to tell nobody official, didn't tell President Biden. So there is that associated question at a time when the US is wired into conflicts around the world. The Secretary of State for Defense effectively was posted missing. That's the subject du jour at the Pentagon. I do wonder if this element of routine on this side of the Atlantic, or the fact that the Americans are playing it low-key, has something to do with avoiding escalation. The less they trumpet any proposed action against the Houthis, then the more likely it is to pass without inflaming interested parties. It should be said that they're probably playing it routine because it is routine as well, Sophie. Bear in mind that US interests and assets in the likes of Iraq and Syria have fairly regularly been attacked by Iranian-backed militia, and the US has duly fired back. But assuming this action goes ahead, if it does, then it comes after Joe Biden has faced considerable pressure from inside the Pentagon as well as elsewhere to strike back against the Houthis, who have launched attacks, not unfettered, but without due retaliation in the minds of many. And Biden, has been criticised for his stewardship throughout this Middle East conflict, come under pressure to re-establish American deterrence in the face of these Red Sea attacks. So it wouldn't be any surprise if the US finally thought that now was the time to assert its power, to demonstrate a willingness to back up the warnings with action. But they're certainly not beating the drum the way that the Brits seem to be at this stage. Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, talking about or using phrases like nothing less than watch this space, a clear signpost to what he was foreseeing. He told us that 24 hours ago. But risks of escalation clearly recognised on both sides of the Atlantic. It's interesting that Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, he's just on his way back from a tour of the Middle East. He took with him a seasoned diplomat, a man by the name of Amos Hochstein, well experienced in dealing with conflict between Iran and Hezbollah. Presumably on that trip, he was speaking to Hezbollah directly. And, I would bow to Sir William Patey on this subject area, but it wouldn't surprise me if the Americans spoke to the interested parties, the parties likely offended by action against the Houthis, just to calm things down and to say, look, this has gone on too long, we need to take action, this is the action we're going to take. It doesn't involve you, don't get involved, because escalation by the likes of yourself isn't in the interests of any of us and isn't in the interests of the wider picture.
Thank you very much indeed. James Matthews there with that update from Washington. As James was saying, a very different tone being struck in the US and in the UK, where we have this cabinet call going on from Downing Street. We know that the Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, is in there, and also the House of Commons Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, expected to be there imminently as well. We'll bring you all the latest, of course, from Downing Street, but let's just finish with our duo for this evening, Salma and Andrew. Andrew, it feels like we're kind of poised, waiting for this action.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully, from what's being said from the US, it will be quite a limited set of strikes that are purely, that are very well targeted, that don't result in civilian casualties, that target infrastructure solely and are accurate. That's the best we can hope for. I think these are clearly going to happen, and the US and the UK in the Red Sea have clearly got the ability to make those happen. There is a bigger risk of escalation, but I think the escalation we need to be worried about is the death toll in Palestine, and we don't talk about that enough. I know that sounds odd because we've been talking about it for 3 months, but tens of thousands of people are dying. I think 250 people a day. We need to be putting a stop to that. That's what is going to de-escalate things in the Middle East, is putting pressure on Israel very firmly and very quickly to stop what's going on there.
There's clearly a fear of escalation in Downing Street, isn't there? And they are doing everything they can to try and get that backing from Cabinet, potentially from Parliament. They're talking to Lindsay Hoyle as well. How worried will they be?
Well, I think it's not a question of worry, depending on what briefing they're getting. And, you've just had Sir William Patey in. They will have their diplomats in the region coming back to them. It'll be part of a wider network of information. So they will be furnished with a lot of intelligence and a lot of tactics, military tactics, to understand how they want to progress it. I think the question that they should be asking themselves is, if we lose control of this situation, what are the repercussions and how do we handle that? So what are the mitigations? And I think, serious decisions, and I hope that they make it well.
Thank you both very much indeed. You're looking at the door of Downing Street. We'll bring you all the latest on the potential attacks on Houthi rebels. Up next, we'll have more on the story with the UK Tonight and Sarah Jane Mee.